views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Hey there, nice to see you. It's time for the Bronx Buzz. This is BronxNet's program where we talk to journalists and writers and filmmakers and videographers. And this evening, we're going to do something even a little bit different. And we're going to talk to a radio DJ. Many people might not be aware that the borough of the Bronx is host to one of the longest running and, frankly, I think one of the most important music radio stations, and that's WFUV, and we're going to bring on a wonderful DJ from WFUV, talk about some very interesting stuff. And also for the second part of our show, you might or might not have heard that David Cruz, the editor of the Norwood News, will be leaving that newspaper, and we'll grill him a little bit and talk about where he's going to be going and all those kinds of things. But now, to start, we go up to the hill, to Rose Hill, and say hello to Darren DeVivo, a radio DJ exemplar from WFUV. Nice to talk to you, Darren. How are you?
Great, Gary. Thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
I'm going to open up the program by letting people on. You and I were just talking about it, but people may not know because they know me from Bronx television, but I was a radio DJ for 15 years, frankly, doing a very similar type of program in music that Darren and WFUV does nowadays. The biggest difference is we use records, and I don't even know what they use. They probably pull something out of the air and put it on. So I have a little bit of background. You and I are simpatico in where we're at. And now let's just talk about you. This is your 36th anniversary on WFUV. Did I get that right?
You got it right. We're right on the 36th anniversary, completely by coincidence, the 36th anniversary of my first show on FUV. It was February 26th, 1984,
Wow.
6 o'clock on a Sunday morning, and a 2-hour show. And I had no clue at the time that a career was born.
Right,
You know,
that you'd be staying on TV. Here we are in 2020, of all things. Just talk to me about your background, about how you got into it. Now, I guess at that time, FUV was only students. Were you a Fordham student?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was back really as it ended up being. That was, I guess you could say, the final years of FUV being a classic college station.
Oh.
Because there was a transition that took place at the very end of the 80s that kind of kicked in come 1990. I walked through the door at FUV in September 83 as a freshman at Fordham. And I went to Fordham specifically to work at, well, I always say I went to Fordham to work at WFUV, and that's true.
Wow.
It helped that Fordham's reputation was what it was, and it helped that Fordham was 2 miles from where I lived in the Morris Park section, where I was from. So I was going to school in my neighborhood, and the school happened to have a heck of a reputation. And, oh, by the way, it has a huge FM 50,000 watt radio station that covers the entire tri-state area. So
win. What made you want to go in and do radio? What drew you to that? And I'm going to tell you what drew me. When we were growing up, I think I'm a touch older than you, but when we were growing up, the playing of rock music off WNEW-FM, later WPLJ, and any of the other rock stations, locally WRNW, this is how we lived. I mean, the radio was in the background all the time, and I was motivated because I was like, wow, you can actually do that? And the music drew me in. I'm curious about you.
It was pretty much the same thing. I mean, I'm a frustrated musician. I mean, I play a mean air guitar, but, in the 70s growing up, there were many guitar lessons that never amounted to more than just a really bad Mary Had a Little Lamb. And the idea popped into my head because I am such a music junkie a music nerd, and I've been one from as far back as I can remember to maybe when I was 4 years old. If I can't play the instruments, I could play the records on the radio. And if musicians can meet girls, then DJs can as well. I quickly found out that you don't meet anybody when you work in radio, although I did ultimately meet my wife. So that's the ultimate win.
You know, I could interject about that. People don't realize, I mean, yes, you're on TV or you do radio, but you're in this little room and you're talking to an inanimate object. You got to realize that. But I will say tangentially, I also met my wife because I was teaching a training session at a college radio station. So there you go. So the music drew you in. You loved doing it. Talk about the kinds of experiences you've had that are unique, because I know what they're like, that are unique to somebody who's been in the music business, who's been part of this thing, that, you know, really have inspired you and made you want to keep going. You know, I don't know, maybe you can make more money doing something else, but, you know, I know what draws people to it. So talk about some of those experiences or memories that really, you know, captivate you.
There's a bunch of them, and I would say that WFUV, having transitioned so much through the 80s, through the 90s, to the present day, format changes, alterations, different styles of music, different genres, it kept it interesting. It very rarely got boring. I learned tons about all kinds of different music that I normally would not have been exposed to. So along the way, more times than not, I was doing something fresh and different and learning at the same time. Mm-hmm. And, you know, and as we got bigger and the reputation of FUV got better and changed from being considered a college radio station to a really significant alternative non-commercial station in New York City, we got a higher profile, and then things like getting the opportunities to meet heroes started to come up.
Name one.
Ringo Starr.
Wow.
Brian Wilson.
Wow.
David Bowie. Peter Gabriel. David Crosby. Wow. That's just, you know, and that helps keep you in.
Yeah, and you feel good, and also you're kind of the conduit through which this flows. The fact is, as I've analyzed, to the degree I've analyzed it in the way that radio has changed, of course, people now do podcasts and they think that's a podcast. It's actually a radio show as far as I'm concerned. But if WFUV didn't play the music that it plays, the expanse of New York City and the spectrum on the radio dial would not have this incredible archive of music played. And that is, to one degree, old style rock and roll or rock records, all the way up to people making this kind of music today. It wouldn't exist in New York, right?
Yeah, there was really never been a station that came anywhere close to what we're like. If that's kind of what you're referring to, we've always sort of done our own thing. There would be the occasional commercial station that might briefly go on the air with a new format that might, in some instances, intersect. But almost the entire time I've worked at FUV, we're a totally unique beast. And being a non-commercial radio station that's not tied to advertising and not tied to corporations, we have that flexibility to do, for lack of a better way of putting it, what we want and play a type of music that you're not getting anywhere else without alienating familiar.
I have got to ask you this question, and you can, give out the secret as much as you want. When I was involved, you would have a structure, and they would say these are, let's say, the more popular records, and during an hour you'd have to play one from column A, one from column B, and then maybe there was DJ's choice, and you could select a record. And again, I don't want to intrude, but how much can you tell us about how much is programmed? Or do you really just have, hey, I got this whole, we used to call it the wall of records, and I could play anything I want?
At the moment, I would say FUV is in the middle of both of those worlds. Completely free format and formatted. It depends on the program, the DJ, the day you're listening, the time of day. It's hard to kind of say we're one thing or another, because we're not. We're still a mix. We're still the last game in town that will go and have a specialty show where the DJ has put the 4 hours together out of his head. And at the same time, we will have kind of a method to our madness, like a formatted station will, but keep that element of surprise and musical exploration alive.
A lot of what we used to do, and I don't know if it still comes to play, is we would, want to mix a record and say, well, this one has a guitar riff that was similar to this one. So, gee, I never heard it like that before. And you'd put them together, and just the structure of the two songs together was kind of part of, as much of the show as the radio personality. You still think like that?
Yes, I actually think maybe slightly more, I do think like that. I think lyrically, though, I might tend to try to link lyrical themes more so possibly than, say, the music end of things. Although, if you said to me, you got 4 hours, do what you want, I wouldn't necessarily go to a very soft acoustic thing like Nick Drake into Judas Priest. I mean, I wouldn't do that, but I tend to think more a little thematically and topically when I'm building a show.
Right. The last thing, now, I, as you know, follow you on Facebook and see what you write. And a lot of times you are the first one who will acknowledge, I don't know, George Harrison's birthday, which was recently, or you'll have the latest news on, something Eric Clapton is doing or whatever. Do you study it? Does it just come to you? I'd like to tap into, in the last few seconds we have, about how hard you work at this. Frankly, to explain to people that it's not all fun and games in a way. You got to work.
No, I'm always tuned in, and I have no life. So both of those things happen. I'm tuned in, and I've always got a screen in front of me. And my nickname on Facebook is the Angel of Death, because I'm usually the first one to announce that a musician has passed or something. So,
listen, Darren, that is the perfect way to end up, because we got to run. This has been an absolute joy, and we'll have you back. Maybe you'll come in here. We can talk old music. I'm going to give you a little bit of trivia real quick before we go. You mentioned David Crosby. Do you know what his middle name is? His middle name is David Van Cortlandt Crosby, and he is, in fact, a descendant of the park in the borough of the Bronx. So there you go.
That I didn't know.
Anyway, Darren, I'll see you on the radio, right? That's what we're going to do.
Sounds good.
All right.
Catch up with
Darren, it's been a pleasure. We're 90.7 WFUV. Check them out, online, on the air, whatever. We got to go. We'll take a break, and we'll be back with David Cruz right after this.
Did you know that brain and spinal cord tumors are the deadliest form of pediatric cancer? They can happen to anyone.
I'm not hungry. My tummy hurts.
You can help us be part of the solution.
Get in here. Hurry.
You can be part of our family.
It's okay.
Please support our mission today. Making Headway Foundation, dedicated to the care, comfort, and cure of children with brain and spinal cord tumors.
Hey, back with you on the Bronx Buzz. I'm going to give him applause for how many years? It's really only 6 years, but he has really made a real contribution to the borough of the Bronx in terms of media. My friend and colleague, David Cruz, currently editor of the Norwood News, but this is not going to last that long. Nice to see you, first of all.
Thank you, Gary.
And you will be leaving the Norwood News. Tell us all about that.
So my last day will be March 18th. I was offered and accepted a job with Gothamist and WNYC, which is the outlet that covers all of New York City. And I will be starting that job on March 30th as a news editor for the team.
Number one, congratulations for
Thank
moving
you.
on, and congratulations. I mean, obviously you have bigger coverage area. Norwood News is a not-for-profit paper. Now you're working for, I mean, maybe WNYC is not-for-profit.
Yeah, it's definitely
but it covers all of the city. It's a bigger job. Again, congratulations. Let's just talk about your time at the Norwood News. Undoubtedly, given the heart and soul you put it into it, the blood, sweat, and tears you put into it, this was a job you loved, and you frankly did very well. Talk about that.
Well, yeah, I really was enamored by the Bronx to begin with. Even before I got to the Norwood News, I was a general assignment reporter at the Bronx Times Reporter. And I think because the Bronx Times Reporter had a wider reach, I was able to venture into places like Norwood and venture into places like Bedford Park and Kingsbridge just to get a better sense of the borough. And I got to know the Norwood News just because they were producing stories that I was interested in, namely the saga of the Kingsbridge Armory. And I was interested in the Norwood News from the very beginning. I read it consistently, and I enjoyed the work that Alex Kratz, my predecessor, had done. And you know, when he told me he was leaving, I was ready to just jump right in. I told him I'm interested.
It made sense. Yeah,
yes, it did
made
make sense, especially having gotten that test in terms of like understanding the stories that were impacting that community.
We have had this dialogue just a little while ago, about a week ago, and I asked you about what your favorite stories or what impact you think you've had, and you talked about development and talked about unwanted development. I mean, and that to me is what is really important about the Norwood News. What you read there really applies to so many other neighborhoods. I mean, what's going on in Bedford Park is very similar to what may be going on in Soundview or in other parts of the Bronx. Just talk to me about the change, and it's only 6 years in terms of historical change, but a lot has changed in the Norwood and Bedford Park areas. Talk a little bit about what has happened and how you feel that you've been able to cover it.
Well, I feel like the quintessential story for both of those neighborhoods has been the 2011 Webster Avenue rezoning. There was a rezoning that took place on Webster Avenue between East Gun Hill and Fordham Road. And those neighborhoods were severely impacted by it. Now, of course, development is a slow go, but once I came in 2013, 2 years after the rezoning had taken effect, I began to witness a lot of greater development happening. And it was welcomed by the community. However, things were sort of not really coming out the way the community thought it was going to look like. There was more supportive housing that was brought in, more affordable housing, and they asked for a first floor storefront, and not too many of those new buildings have one because
do they have the storefronts or they don't have occupancy?
Well, there's both, because if you're a supportive housing building, you do not have to comply with the requirement. But then there are other empty storefronts. And meantime, when I look back, they wanted cafes, they wanted bookstores, they wanted shopping, and you don't see any of that. And so it's kind of, in a way...
It's like a mixed bag.
It is a mixed bag, and it kind of went a little bit bust.
You know, what is fascinating about what you said is Number one, they community members, maybe Community Board 7 and other advocates wanted a certain thing. And then they came in and said, well, we have supportive housing. On the other hand, in many cases, you need that supportive housing. Listen, a part of the solution is right down the block on Webster Avenue. And that means there is a community of people who need affordable housing, supportive housing, and all those things. So on one hand, we got to have it. On the other hand, of course, people want to see the coffee shops a little, kind of loosen up the neighborhood, so to speak. I don't know how to balance the two needs, but what you're saying is it didn't really happen.
No, I mean, there is no cafe and there's no bookstore to be said from the new developments that have come up on Webster
And no
Avenue.
Prospects really for that kind of thing.
At the moment, no.
Norwood has had a reputation, and I think largely, I don't want to say largely, but in large part, due to the Norwood News, of having a lot of advocates, of people who know what's going on in their community, who speak out about things. For example, the Norwood News had a story this week about a senior center that's concerned about the bus redesign because there's no stop, or they're going to eliminate a stop in front. And that the Norwood News generates the advocacy, and I think that part of the Bronx has had that advocacy. How has that advocacy played? Has it played through the past half dozen years in that part of the Bronx?
I would say so. Especially,
You think it has?
I would say so. I mean, people do actually read the paper. I mean, I can tell you the community board reads the paper, especially whenever they say, I saw it in the Norwood News. And that begins the conversation. It doesn't mean necessarily that the paper is leading it, but at least it's starting the conversation. And that's what you kind of want in a paper, in a community paper, to help point out something that maybe the community board had missed, something that maybe they're not really thinking too deeply on or paying too much attention on, and you bring the focus to that issue.
You have been a supporter in general, not only at the Norwood News, but in general for community media.
Right.
Just before we went on the air just now, we were talking about the state of Bronx media. I believe we're underserved. The Norwood News is going to take some kind of hit. They'll have to find a replacement. Talk about how you see community media in the Bronx. How are we doing? What do we need? Et cetera, et cetera. What is the effect of it, et cetera?
Well, I do think that we are underserved. There's not too many papers here in the borough, and there's not too many
Norwood
reporters.
News, I'm going to name them because we have the people on the show. Right. Norwood News, Riverdale Press, Mott Haven Herald, Bronx Times, Hunts Point Express to a lesser degree. And that's really about it,
Correct. I mean, in terms of original...
1.4 million people.
Right, exactly. And the thing is, this borough has a myriad of pressing issues that need to be addressed. And the more coverage you give it, the better the outcome can be, and the faster the outcome can be as well. And so, right, there's, everyone is segmented. Everyone is covering a different portion of the borough. And of course, it would be great to have like one paper that covers the entire borough.
And a daily newspaper at that, because, I mean, these are all weeklies.
And there are other publications in other parts of the city that have a daily publication devoted to the borough.
A perfect segue is that there's then another level of citywide publications like City Limits, The City, Gothamist. There used to be DNA Info. That was really much bereaved by many advocates in the Bronx and throughout the city. So talk about your focus, what you take from being a Norwood News editor to those citywide publications.
Well, I will tell you that within the 6 years that I've been here, I think it always mattered to me to listen to readers, to listen to the people, to listen to what it is that's on their mind. Because sometimes, one thing I've learned is that perhaps the story that you think is not a story turns out to actually be a story when you get a greater sense of what the story is about. Because maybe someone is not explaining it on a news level. They're explaining it on very layman terms. But the more you begin to talk to the people and understand what is at stake, the more you flesh out a story. And I think I'd like to take that with me to, Gothamist, not really report from a perch and really just absorb what it is that people are worrying about.
Will you have a beat, like you'll be the housing guy or the transportation guy or something like that? Or
well, that remains to be seen, but I do think that my understanding of the Bronx was very helpful.
I hope you're going to keep writing about us.
Oh yeah. There's definitely there's a lot to cover here in the borough. So I won't imagine that my time here in the Bronx will not translate to my time at Gothamist. I think they'll definitely use that.
Another thing which was handed down, and we'll credit people like Dart Westfall and Jordan Moss, and you mentioned Alex Kratz, that was handed down from them in establishing and developing the Norwood News over the years, is use of young people and running an intern program. What is that like, and do you think you've really helped seed the clouds with young journalists who can do a little better and cover the Bronx or really, get good careers?
I think that, the program itself, all I did was, I brought in about 3 or 4 interns we usually would work around a college semester. And so we would bring them in for a few months.
3 or 4, that's significant.
And we would, basically go start working on their craft. They had a baseline understanding of what it is, what news is, but it was more just helping them restructure their news stories, helping them write tighter. And I would go over the copy with them as they were sitting next to me. And I think that helped them a great deal.
Only a moment left. Two-part question. A, what will you miss most about being in the North Bronx? And then B, what are you really looking forward to going to the new job? So start with A. What are you going to miss most about your work here at the Norwood News?
Well, I always loved walking around Norwood. Itself is a very interesting, geographically laid out community. I mean, it sounds like you can get lost in Norwood. And I still think to this day that I do. So I always loved walking around that community. A lot of history over there. And then second thing that I'm looking forward to Gothamist is perhaps bringing the Bronx a little bit, giving it a little bit more of a...
More play.
Yeah, more play.
More play.
Yeah, exactly.
That kind of thing. Do you anticipate turning out a story every day? I mean, do we know? We don't know how that's going to work out.
Not sure yet, but I'm looking forward to this ride.
David Cruz, you're still going to be a friend. You're still going to be a colleague, and we certainly hope that you will come up here to the Bronx Buzz, or even on the phone or whatever, because we're going to need to have you with us. I should mention this program. BronxNet, WFUV, and the Norwood News has engaged in a project. So we had WFUV on. Now we have, to some degree, the Norwood News on. That's been a good collaboration, right?
Oh, yeah, that was great.
Talk about bringing media together.
Oh, yeah, we definitely leverage each other, sort of resources and each other's audiences, yeah.
Famous last words, anything from David before we beat him off, before he gets on his horse like the Lone Ranger and rides into the sunset? No last words.
It was a great ride.
It was a great ride. Hi-O Silver in a way.
Exactly.
David Cruz, the great David Cruz, has been the Norwood News editor. I'm sure the paper will continue in great form. They'll find somebody.
Yeah.
Nobody can replace David. Just like we said, nobody could replace Jordan or Alex. So there we go. All right, that's going to do it for the Bronx Buzz. We will see you next week. And on Bronx Talk, this is a local issue. On Bronx Talk this week, we're going to talk about the Jerome Park Reservoir and get to the bottom, figuratively and literally, of what's going on at the reservoir. And then the week after, Gustavo Rivera will join us and we'll talk about healthcare and all the other interesting things in Albany.